There's some debates we can get into around, is AI going to replace people, augment? I can tell you we're squarely in the augment part of that argument. And, I'll give you an example. Let's take sales engineers. Typically, companies may have 1-6, maybe 1-7 ratio of sales engineers to account executives or sales reps.
Welcome to Growth Unlocked, Beyond Scale, your gateway to the deeper dimensions of business and personal growth. This series goes beyond traditional metrics, exploring the philosophies, mindsets, habits, and life lessons from those who've successfully navigated the landscape of entrepreneurship and leadership. Peer into the minds of those who've mastered the art of business innovation, partnerships, and those that are rewriting the rules of revenue. Tap into their actionable advice and practical playbooks that can be used to unlock growth in your own world.
Welcome back to another episode of Growth Unlocked. I'm your host, Kieran Cron. From Founding Appteligent, who are acquired by VMware, to leading AirCover, Andrew Levy has consistently pioneered technology-driven solutions that reshape industries. A seasoned entrepreneur and an engineer, Andrew's journey includes recognition as a Y Combinator alumni, highlighting his ability to innovate, scale ventures, and lead successful exits in a highly competitive market. Andrew, thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, excited to dive in here.
Likewise. So, Andrew, reflecting on your entrepreneurial path, what lessons from founding Appteligent have you applied to building AirCover?
Yeah, so I'll back up a bit here. So the company before AirCover actually was originally called Criticism. It had kind of a funny name, focused on mobile developers. It was an analytics solution. So if you use Netflix between 2011 and 2019, we powered all their telemetry, network performance, error monitoring, among other great brands. We were on something like 1 billion devices worldwide. And as you mentioned, VMware acquired us in 2017. We could probably spend the whole podcast talking about learnings from that journey. But along the way, we of course had to scale our own sales team. Just in terms of building a company, there was a lot of lessons there. Just one example, we had built this big outside sales force where really it was more of a transactional inside sales model. When we started the company, customer success wasn't, there's just murmurs of that being a kind of a separate part of the organization. It really wasn't well built out across the industry. That's something that I think really could have benefited us from the beginning. And, after the acquisition, that's where, suddenly we were, at our peak, we're just under 100 people, but, VMware with thousands of employees, we had to train, coach, and enable the VMware field. This was a new product in a new space. And, these sellers were either, used to selling it to the data center or to IT teams to manage devices and applications. And, analytics was, from a product perspective, completely new, new messaging, new positioning, new personas, new competitors, new partners, everything. And, what I experienced is what we see across a lot of organizations, which is that, the core selling motion, reps can get comfortable, selling that. The attach becomes an issue as you have a large number of products and services. It's hard to ramp new reps. You're often, these products require a lot of domain expertise. And so, going back to the VMware experience, we'd get them into training, we'd throw content over the wall and try to get them to engage with it. And it just wasn't scaling the way we wanted it to. And even at times when we felt like we got the team to a good spot, new products released, new competitor comes out, you had to basically do it all over again. So the thought was, what if we could essentially virtualize the best parts of your organization? The best account executive, the best competitive intelligence specialist, the best pricing specialist, and have all these functions ride along with the reps in every conversation and help them live in these, in these calls. And so that's how AirCover was born. And that was June of 21.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard that from a few other founders actually, that it seems like there's this common thread where startups and ventures are born off the back of a problem being identified in an existing company that you're looking to solve for. And then you've obviously seen that there's wider application for that. Like, most inside sales companies that have that motion have a similar issue. So I can understand, and I've seen that like time after time. Is how do we, like, companies really want to close the gap between like their top and their bottom performer, and part of that is also thinking about how they codify and take out sort of what their top performers are doing, that and transfer that knowledge and that IP across the sales org.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually that was that pattern of scratching your own itch, if you want to call it that, was that's my last company was the same way. We had built a bunch of apps, they were slow and crashing, so we built software to deal with it. Similarly with AirCover, we ran into a bunch of those issues that were kind of systemic in the industry around how do you know basically more up level the entire sales team, get them up to speed on new products and services. And the state of the art at the time was, okay, let's try to record a conversation and rewatch it, make sense of it, do one-on-one coaching. Speaking of analytics, the analytics in the space were pretty rudimentary. It was tracking a keyword, right? And that wasn't that helpful. So when AirCover got started, it was really about not only let's help you live in a conversation, but from a data and a platform perspective, how can we start to gather really unique insights that have now been unlocked through the use of large language models, where we can really start to move beyond let's just track a keyword to let's understand why various patterns and trends are emerging among your sales team. Why are customers buying or not buying? Why are you being successful against a competitor or not? And then, of course, tie it all back to pipeline progression. Understand what's working, what's not working, and suddenly you get this really nice feedback loop around, funneling those insights back to your team, driving where you want to invest your coaching, your enablement efforts, to raise the bar across the org.
Mm. And I think beyond that, one of the things that I love about this kind of solution is how it actually, from a RevOps perspective, ties everything together, right? Because you're taking these insights that customers and prospects are giving you when they're having conversations with your sales team and even your customer success team, and then you can take those insights out, the voice of the customer, and then feed back into demand generation, product marketing, etc. Even the way that you basically like drive your overall messaging strategy. Because I think the mistake that a lot of companies make is they think that they know what the customer cares about, and they put out messaging that doesn't really resonate with the market. So it's a much more effective way of doing it, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and you touched on a nuance that's important to call out, which is that that typically a lot of this data, um, it was solid within different parts of the org, but it also just wasn't good enough to have that kind of cross-functional impact. But we're now at the point where, I'll give you one example. I'll have to scrub the customer name, but it was a very large financial services company in the U.S. Their marketing team actually joined one of our QBRs that we were doing, where we were reviewing results with the sales team, and they saw these top 10 reasons on why customers are moving to their solution or buying their solution over their competitor's solution. And they looked at it and they were like, holy shit, there's 3 or 4 out of these 10 items are not on our website. Right. So we should go back and update our website and address this head on. And so that was just amazing to see that, again, that cross-functional impact of having these insights. And just one example of what you can do now with some of the advances in AI to be able to analyze that scale and derive that type of data.
Yeah, I love it. So, I guess considering the really rapid evolution of AI in sales, I mean, things are changing on a daily basis. How do you foresee AI agents transforming traditional sales roles and processes over the next 5 years?
That's a good question, and there's some debates we can get into around, is AI going to replace people, augment. I can tell you we're squarely in the augment, part of that argument. And, I'll give you an example. Let's take sales engineers, right? So typically companies may have a 1 to 6, maybe 1 to 7 ratio of sales engineers to account executives or sales reps. Well, imagine you could fill the remaining seats, 5 or 6 seats with a virtualized SE, have them ride along in every conversation, help to answer technical questions. And in that case, we're not, replacing anyone. We're giving more leverage to the existing team. We're helping them scale. And frankly, those positions are hard to hire for today. Putting aside the fact that, yes, it would be expensive to have that ratio, but the talent's just not there. And, arguably filling those seats with those, AI agents would help you sell more products, be more productive, and arguably cause you to hire more people, right? So it's very similar to that argument around, you have some traffic, so we're going to build more lanes in a highway, and suddenly, you get even more traffic because there's more people using the road. And I think something very similar is happening here. Now, certainly there will be changes to how organizations are structured. You may be going back to the sales engineers, maybe some of those folks will transition to, focus only on high value enterprise accounts. Maybe you'll have more of a focus on post sales and more of a white glove service, where the human relationships really matter. So I'm not saying the organization won't change as a whole, but I do think that there's a tremendous opportunity to, really just give the sales team, more efficiency, more productivity, kind of extend their abilities. Now, the other way to look at it is from a kind of automating work perspective. And, it's still very much early days for a lot of organizations. Certainly you have a lot of startups and to some extent the mid-market companies, going all in and trying every AI tool they can. But a lot of what we're seeing in the enterprise and a lot of traditional industries, they are very much excited about AI, but they're still in that POC phase. They want to know where to place their bets. They're smart enough to know they're not going to miss this technology wave. A lot of these companies, were very late to say moving to cloud, as one example. So in some cases, in pretty much every case, we're seeing that, they recognize the value, the potential impact. But in terms of very large scale deployments, that's where a lot of companies are. You have the more forward looking companies leaning in and doing that, certainly. But we're still seeing a lot of large organizations that, they just want to figure out what their strategy is. And so, they're trying it out in, it could be a specific business unit, specific group. And, I think we're at the cusp of seeing as an industry much larger wide scale deployments. And so in some sense, it's a race to get there because you have a lot of AI companies competing to get to those large scale deployments. I guess the last thing I'll mention on that is when we do talk to, say, a CIO about what their AI strategy would be, my advice is to think about it in the following lens. What are the net new unlocks? What couldn't you do before that's possible now? Because that's where you'd really want to lean in and make your investments. And the reason for that is a lot of legacy providers are trying to add a thin layer on top of their existing product and call it AI when it's really just an interface to talking to your data or your product. It's not a net new capability that you couldn't do in the past.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit more in terms of like what are those net new opportunities that you're seeing for companies?
Yeah. So obviously AirCover would be in that bucket because even a few years ago, even putting aside actually advancements with large language models, the compute wasn't there. It would be very much too expensive to run something like this, to be able to do real-time analysis of conversation as you're speaking in a low latency way, right? That just wasn't something that, even when we first started the company in June of 21, we were just about there. And LLMs really unlock the last mile of, okay, now we have the ability to process this in real time. How can we make even better sense of it, right? There's certainly, AI and ML is not new, but these latest models, the latest frontier next generation foundational models have really given us the ability to take a large corpus of data and documents and start to understand it and take action on it, as you're speaking. So that's one example of kind of what I put in that net new capability bucket.
Mm, yeah, yeah, and it's a really powerful one. I think just it's new now, but I can just see this being the norm, for kind of in the future, like any kind of inside sales business
Yeah.
would be mad not
Well,
to be. Yeah.
I'll give you an example. People have been trying to do this. So we're focused on sales right now, but if you look at the customer support, the service center space, for a long time, there was this push to having an AI agent assist. Really the state of the art was the chatbot, right? Like, talk to it, and we all know those weren't the greatest things in the world. And then you have your automated systems when you call up and try to troubleshoot, and it's more of a directed graph of, did you try this, do this, right? But now, I think when you talk about replacing people or augmenting, you're seeing that on the service center side and the customer support side, the tier one reps being replaced. And, that was a push that started before the current AI wave, with some of those technologies I just mentioned, right? So this just accelerated that existing trend in that space. But yeah, they, basically that's being transformed, and that's something that was unlocked by AI as another, just to give you another example, but was a trend that was already occurring.
Mm, yeah, it's a good call out. I guess with all of this, when it comes to anything, whether it's AI or any kind of new technology, there's always an element of, I guess, perceived risk for the business that's looking to bring it in, and there's always going to be some sort of potential road bumps along the way. I mean, what challenges do you think that companies face in adopting these types of technologies, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the change management is a great question. I think this is why you see when you talk about AI agents doing work and automated workflows, you still very much have human in the loop, for a lot of that, which just means, okay, I'm going to draft an email, but I won't send it on your behalf, or I'm going to, and by the way, that's an example of something that most likely, will be fully automated. But as you get towards more sensitive data, especially in the financial side, you also have issues where just the laws and the rules and regulations haven't caught up to the technology. Where Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, would require traceability, logging. You have to really understand who was involved in these financial decisions, and so that becomes murky when it's an AI involved. So I think there's some areas where we're going to just see, the quote unquote human in the loop still be there for quite some time. One of the capabilities that we announced is this ability to generate a quote while you're live on a call, right? So you can imagine, the compliance checks and everything else that needs to go on underneath the covers, but we're certainly not going to send a quote without the human, first looking at it, and first, someone has to basically give the stamp of approval. And so I think that, there will be a whole set of workflows that, yes, we will automate, and maybe it will be like, generating an NDA where you don't necessarily care. It's filling in some form fields, and it's not really sensitive, but there will be a whole other class that will take some time from a change management point of view, not just at the organization level, but as an industry that will take time to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I guess the other part is just the education piece, right? Which is all part of change management, but making sure that people that might be resistant to AI actually understand the benefits around it. Because, there definitely is, like you were saying before, some of this sense of fear about, it's going to take our jobs. And, people do worry about the kind of existential threat of AI. So I think the more that you can just educate people around that, um, I'd say probably these larger enterprise companies, like they would have, dedicated teams that are going to be part of this process.
Yeah, yeah, and we're seeing new titles emerge, along those lines. They have like AI strategy titles that didn't exist before. I really think it's a rehash of the, if you remember, the digital transformation titles that we've seen over the past decade, where it is. I mean, the space is changing so rapidly; it's hard for anyone to stay up to date. So it makes sense to have, you know, someone or a group of people focused on, okay, what is our strategy here? How do we evaluate the various solutions out in the space? I mean, what's your internal strategy, or what are we building versus what are we buying? So there's a lot that goes into that.
Mm. Yeah, and it's a good point as well around the building versus buying, because I can imagine, certain companies that have got the capital and the resource are probably thinking about, do we just build and deploy this internally as opposed to looking for a third party vendor? Is that something that you've got any opinions on?
Yeah, we don't see it as much for our software, because the kind of the nature of what we do, analyzing audio in real time and making sense of it at scale. There's quite a bit there. But what we do see in terms of build is, certainly companies that have large technical capabilities, large engineering teams, playing around with large language models in house, having like a internal chat gpt type instance. And there is this question of, okay, can I bring my own llm byo? And I think for some solutions that could work. Some solutions that maybe have low latency, or don't have low latency requirements, I should say, where maybe it's like I don't know. I'll give you an example, like an RFP AI system, right? Like that may work, where you can take your time to fill out a document, and then plug into an internal repository. But I guess the answer is, it really depends on the solution and what you're trying to do.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Uh, I guess sort of given your experience with Apptelligent's acquisition by VMware, what kind of insights can you share around navigating that transition from startup to acquisition for other founders that might be listening to this? And how has that influenced your leadership at AirCover?
Yeah, with the acquisition, it was, we had built that relationship early with VMware. They were a partner. They're actually also an investor in that company, right? And so we got to know them among others, other potential acquirers. We came in with a lens of, how can we work together, not necessarily with trying to get acquired, but we spent time to build those relationships. And you know beyond that, we I think if you're thinking about starting a company, it is good to have some of that experience that we were talking about earlier, where if we hadn't gone through that VMware experience, we probably wouldn't have started AirCover. We wouldn't have seen how a company at that scale operates and where are the gaps. Certainly, plenty of people start companies right out of college, and I'm not saying don't do that, but if you're thinking about building enterprise software, of course it helps to have that experience. I think there also is something to joining a startup, seeing it from the inside, and again, you'll see what works, what doesn't work in terms of building your own organization.
Mm. One of the things that I'm seeing now, Andrew, and I'm sure you're pretty well aware of this, especially leading a company, is just the rate of disruption that's happening. Like the companies that were born 20 years ago, they're still around. Not all of them, but I think that a lot of companies now that are getting born and might get born in the next 6 to 12 months, might not be around for even 12 months, 24 months. And there's definitely this opportunity now where I guess the barrier to entry in terms of like creating software has never been easier to get into, with apps like Replit and Lovable, etc., that are popping up. I'd love to get your perspective on that. I mean, like how, like as a CEO of a company, how do you think about building a moat when, obviously you're in a space where you do have other competitors now, and there's probably going to be more competitors coming in the future? How do you think around building a moat in this rate, or just the age of disruption that we're living in now?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like, everyone and their mom is vibe coding these days, right? uh, I guess I'll get to the moat in a second, but what I'd say on that is it's definitely an opportunity for an organization, for a startup. Uh, you know, there's a reason the revenue per head expectations are going up now. The margin expectations are going up. It's because you can really, the cliche of create the 10x developer is true. You can build something in a few days that would have taken weeks or months, like orders of magnitude reduction. Now, you know, it's, I do think that there is something to be said about having senior folks that can architect a solution and then generate code off of that well architected solution, because that vibe coded GitHub repo is going to grow extremely large and be unwieldy and unmanageable. And I guess a lot of those people better hope that the context windows open up to be large enough where they can just dump the whole thing in and ask the LLM to fix it. But it's just not, it's not the case today. And so you do get a bunch of, these solo founders that haven't written code, but are, throwing their hat in the ring, running into walls that they may not have otherwise. So, there's a lot of opportunity, but caution if you're not going about it the right way. Now, in terms of moat, I think there's a lot of ways that you could think about that. I think this is where specific domain expertise comes into play. Some people go deep within a vertical. Some people, if they're going horizontal and building out more of a platform, then it becomes, okay, what is the, obviously what's the difficulty of building what you're building? We chose to take that a little bit of that approach. I mean, we are going deep in I guess you consider sales as a vertical, but we're not necessarily saying we're only going to stick within, financial services or technology or manufacturing. So, we have some unique insights on the sales side, although we're starting to see more use cases even outside of sales. But, for us, the mode is, okay, helping someone as they're speaking, knowing what to service, knowing what to automate in terms of a workflow. There is a lot of IP there that can actually be built. But if you're if you're just building something to generate marketing collateral, where's the moat, right? Like it's you can do that by yourself on ChatGPT today. So there has to be something more than just what an LLM can generate today.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I guess like the point you made there around like domain expertise and IP is important. But I still think that there's got to be in the back of your mind, okay, like, people can still build this stuff, like people can re-engineer software, and, who knows like what's going to happen in the future with the way that some of these technologies are going. I guess outside of that, I mean, one of the things that I've seen other software companies doing is leaning pretty heavily into partnerships as a moat, in terms of having businesses that are massive, like, advocates for their technology. They help them to go to market. They also provide this almost kind of like shielding and barrier, like HubSpot had done that pretty well, like over the last kind of 15 or 16 years. That's just one example of sort of how I see businesses building moats.
Yeah, from a go-to-market perspective, for sure. I guess tying that back to product, there's also the question of what network effects that you're building into the system. It does become stickier as either more well, ideally more customers using it, but even if not, more seats within a customer using it, is the other way to think about it. Um, so yeah, I think there's a lock in retention, as one, and there's been some that's been in the news lately. I don't know if you saw with 11x, and there was that rumor around 90% churn rate with that company that TechCrunch reported on. And then yeah, outside of that, distribution has always been, I'd say that's been something that's been true for a very long time. Pre AI, where we've seen products that maybe aren't the best in the space win because they just had a better channel, a better way to distribute it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the CEO, I mean, how do you view the ownership of the go-to-market strategies? Is that something that you think sits with the CEO and is like a large part of the responsibility of someone that's captaining the ship?
I think, I mean, ultimately, uh, I'm a big fan of, if you're familiar with servant leadership, where you're really at the disposal, and your time is to really help your direct reports, step up and uh, do the best work. And so, yes, ultimately, if there's indecisiveness in an organization, yes, the CEO should make that call. But at the end of the day, your responsibility is to hire the best people, set the direction for the company, and ideally, you're leaning on not only your CRO or VP of sales and your marketing team, but also a great set of advisors that you've put around yourself. I'll give you an example. We're, you know, like a year or two ago, we started to see more contact center opportunities in business, come up. And so, we made sure to lean into that space, start bringing in advisors, work with people that, had that experience, so that we were effective in that market.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. I guess shifting gears a bit to more look at the personal side, Andrew, reflecting on your career, how have your personal values and experiences shaped the culture and vision of the teams that you've led?
Yeah. Well, I think the being a second time founder is great because you can reflect on, everything that you would have done differently and apply those learnings. And, actually think culture wise, the first time around, it was great. I think there was some changes I would have made in terms of the personalities that we hired, and, just really, um, I putting heavy emphasis on that, even if you think you've identified someone that's an amazing talent, but they're frustrating to work with, that should really be a red flag for you as an organization. And so just I don't. There's a lot of cliche phrases around this, like you don't want to work with a holes, and it's um, you're I, basically you're spending more time at work than with family and things, like putting all that aside. It's I enjoy what I do. I want to be surrounded by other people that are curious and enjoy what they do. I want to mentorship should go both ways. I want to learn, and yes, I hope that people can learn from me. I want to learn from them, right? Some people say to hire people that are smarter than you. I mean, yeah, I guess you could think that way, but I think uh, that's a pretty broad statement. I think you really want to, yes, you want to hire the best people, and you want to try to learn from them in those areas that you may, have gaps in. And there was actually this old article by a partner at Google Ventures. It's probably I don't know, 14 years old by now, but it talked about firing yourself, which I thought was a great lesson for first time founders as you're scaling the business, because there tends to be this tendency to like not let go, and it really hurts your ability to scale. And so I think that's something that we've definitely embraced, and it ties back to what we were talking about with servant leadership and really empowering your team, where maybe if you're a first-time founder, you may not have, maybe haven't, if you have, especially if you haven't worked in an organization before, that can be a difficult transition. So yeah, that's, I guess that was a long way to answer your question.
No, but you covered some interesting points there, and I wanted to dig into the topic of culture because I think that is something that is often overlooked by startups and earlier stage companies. What's your approach, or even like what's your philosophy and importance around culture and building that within a company?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's what I was describing around, it's, in addition to those traits, it is making sure that you are also setting an example, of course. You can't just say, I want culture X, Y. It's not something you can say. It's much of an action and a way that you carry yourself and communicate, especially with a lot of teams being virtual. That communication becomes critical. And I think in some ways you really need to over communicate, and it's also, you also have that old adage that you need to say something like 7 times for someone to fully internalize it, right? So it's about how you communicate. It's about the actions and what you do that really set the tone for culture. And it's not just you; it also has to be your direct reports, your management, and that will really set the tone for the organization.
Yeah, well said. Andrew, what advice would you offer to go-to-market leaders that are looking to innovate within the company that they're working at this point in time, just in the realm of where we're at with AI and technology?
Well, I'd say that there's a lot of, going back to some of what we talked about with replacing people or augmenting people. I think a lot of the solutions that have talked about replacing people have really, it hasn't worked out that well. An example being AI SDRs. It just hasn't produced the results that people had imagined. And I mean, in some ways it makes sense. If everything is, if all content's now suddenly being generated and you're being spammed, very broadly, you're just going to ignore it. So it's, as much as you try to personalize it, it is working in some capacities, like inbound qualification. If you're virtualizing that that's less about replacing someone and more of just, augmenting the tooling they have available. So I'd say, don't buy into that hype as one piece of advice. They're just learnings I can share from other founders. And the other is similar to what I mentioned with how I would speak to, say, a CIO, is give the same advice to a CRO as they're evaluating solutions. Is it's kind of the art of the possible. Like how can you give your team a competitive edge, especially with the world changing so quickly? It's how can you enable your team to basically message more effectively, compete more effectively, move faster, and so that's how I give advice to them.
Yeah, nice one. I always like to ask my guest, Andrew, let's say if you could just teleport and go back in time to have a conversation with yourself at age 21, what advice would you be giving Andrew at that point in time?
Yeah. Other than Bitcoin and all those other things.
I mean, we can go there.
Yeah, I that's a tough question. I think when I was 21, I just graduated college. HP paid for me to move out to Silicon Valley and gave me a job. That wasn't the most exciting job for a new college hire. I think I could have. One piece of advice to give myself is, if you really wanted work experience before you started a company, which is what I did, pick a different company, because I did. With that said, though, I met one of my future co-founders, so it wasn't all lost. And I did work on some data warehousing projects, and it got me into the analytics space. But and this is more specific to me, is that I probably would have worked at a high growth startup straight out of school to get some of that work experience and to just, as when you're fresh out of school, you don't have as much commitments. You can kind of go all in with what you want to do versus like more of a 9 to 5, which is, what that was, what HP was at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe take a few more risks, maybe take a bit of a punt when you're not going to fall as hard.
And it wasn't even it's funny. I hadn't even considered, maybe this was 2007. So, maybe it was just the sign of the times, but I didn't even consider working for a startup. I think now, if I graduated now, it's much more in the zeitgeist of, people talk about startups a lot more, but, at that moment, it just wasn't a thing that people did. And I went to school on the East Coast of the US, Silicon Valley being on the West Coast in the Bay Area. And so I was disconnected from that world until I got out here into Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Andrew, thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. If people want to connect with you or learn a bit more about what you're doing over there at AirCover, what's the best place for them to connect with you or follow along?
Yeah, feel free to shoot me a note. I'm Andrew at aircover.ai. And happy to chat further with any folks listening.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Growth Unlocked Beyond Scale. If you enjoyed the show, it would really be appreciated if you can leave a 5-star review wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, why not subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes? If you'd like to learn about how to drive profitable scale in your business, gain clarity on your direction, and improve your business valuation, click the link in the show notes to connect with Kieran.